Thank you, Apostolos, for the invitation and your wonderful initiative. I think it's very important to combine the resources here, and this is exactly what we're actually going to talk about here now. I think it's also important to broaden our perspectives here, because there are actually a number of converging social changes and reforms and events that are coming together here on Lesbos and in Europe currently. The first here is, of course, the Greek economic crisis. Then you have the migration streams and the situation in the Middle East and Europe, political situation in Europe at the moment. But you also have a process where European states are looking for new forms of organizing their welfare states. And then you have new forms of volunteerism. And all these different processes and movements point to a really strong need for social innovation and creating new models. So when it comes to the welfare state sustainability in general, we have come to the realization that the model we've built, which was a social innovation in itself in its time, is no longer sustainable because of demographic changes and new costs and so forth. And they're strongly pointing at two solutions: technology and the voluntary sector. This is supposed to solve the dilemmas we're facing as welfare states and societies now. There's a new term, co-creation. We're no longer talking as strongly about governing and government authorities, the control the authorities have over the communities, but we're talking about engaged citizenship. We're talking about Municipality 3.0, which is supposed to be a completely new form of organizing this, where active, engaged citizens take far more control over their own lives and others' lives, and are engaged in volunteerism and so forth. This also creates a strong demand for new forms of competencies in facilitating this engagement. And also at the same time that we're talking about this involving the voluntary organizations in a much stronger sense in local societies, volunteerism in itself is changing tremendously. Whereas before people were usually very loyal to big NGOs and stayed with them for years and years, now we're seeing a change towards what we call a more ad hoc volunteerism, which is linked with increased individualism, increased needs to put voluntary activities on people's CVs as a part of their business or their careers in general. And people no longer want to be under the control of the big NGOs as they used to be. The biggest growing sector in tourism is voluntourism, where people pay to go to other countries to not only have a vacation, but to do meaningful social activities. And people are increasingly starting their own NGOs. They're referred to as Mongos, my own non-governmental organization. There's a rise in immigrants associations, which is also about the aspect of self-organization, which was discussed earlier today. And information technologies and apps and all this are helping coordinate these new activities in new ways. So all this challenges the traditional forms of crisis management as well, because they were efficient in its own context. But now the contexts are changing, and we need to look for new forms of managing this as well. And this is what All this is what we're seeing here in Lesbos also, all across Europe actually. So there's a need to help find these new solutions and help this social innovation. So here on Lesbos, we had a look. We studied the development of the voluntary engagement on the island from 2015, and we've looked at least 4 phases that we can distinguish how the resources have collaborated.
Yeah, we have to keep it very short in the 8 minutes, but if we just run quick through some characteristics with each of the phases that we have identified here. We are also writing on an article, so you can find the details there in hopefully some months. The field work we have done here on the island since the winter of 2015, it was as spontaneous as much of the other activities that have been conducted here on the island the last 2 or 3 years. So we just, during the winter, we understood that something big was going to happen. So we just traveled down here and started to do some field work to essentially try to understand what was happening and try to understand how these volunteer engagement was developing during the crisis. So we started out in the spring from April, around April, until the summer. We identified as one phase as the impending crisis started to escalate, and within just a few months, it all exploded in August, September 2015. And one of the things that happened then was this huge participation of ad hoc volunteers and many resources, but also much chaos the first month or months of this period. Then we've just in 2 months or so, the autumn of 2015, all these chaotic and ad hoc voluntary work started to develop and into systems and routines to coordinate the work much stronger. And also the big NGOs started to arrive and take more control in the situation along with the public authorities. This phase was developing further until the spring of 2016, and the well-known agreement between EU and Turkey came there in April. And then we found it meaningful to describe this phase as a fortress Europe and resistance phase. And what we are really interested in now is what's coming next, what is the next phase, and how can we meet this together with all the other that are engaged in what's happening here.
So there's a need to reassess the situation and the path dependencies that you talked about earlier, Apostolos, and to look at how, in a best case scenario, we can actually create Lesbos here as a model of future crisis management, because the opportunities are certainly here, based on co-creation and based on not a needs assessment as a first step, but a resource mapping as a first step, which is something they utilize in asset-based community development models to great success. And in this case, you have to look at all the different volunteers involved. There is not only the big organizations and the ad hoc volunteers. You have the local individuals and the local grassroots movements. You have the international ad hocs and growing into grassroots movements in themselves. And then you have the large traditional NGOs. And then you also have the refugees, which is probably one of the most important components in this process. And I totally agree with you that we have to foster a multidimensional refugee identity. What we're seeing now with refugees visible in the streets with hunger strikes and as beggars, it's really detrimental to the situation overall, I think. And to rather start with the mapping the resources that are existent in the refugee camps and among the refugees that arrived here. You can do this systematically once they arrived, along with all the other information that you gather about them. Then you can start building more resources together, and then the task is to facilitate how all these resources are going to be combined, because you cannot build trust through all these new technological devices. The trust has to be built by people sitting down and meeting each other and interacting. And you need time for this process. You need neutral backbone organizations that don't have any specific agendas in this. There are neither the local population, neither NGOs, and neither the authorities. It needs to be based on broad inclusion and to provide these social arenas like you're doing here today, but in a much broader sense. And not only for conversations, but for sharing information, for developing common ideas, to getting to know all these initiatives, not only on Lesbos, but all across Europe. We have a tremendous amount of initiatives, and we don't really need to invent the wheel each time, but just sharing these approaches it has a tremendous value in itself. And the most important thing, in order to not strangle all these initiatives, in a sense, and risk that all these initiatives dwindle and die, if the government, so to speak, takes control of this and tries to decide what all the volunteers are supposed to do in all this, then you strangle the initiatives. And rather in this co-creation perspective, we need to water it. And give it inspiration. So each actor can contribute, with their particular sets of competencies and resources, and it's the combined efforts that really make the difference between an ant and an anthill. So this is something we can develop here, and also there are tremendous opportunities to develop meaningful volunteerism on Lesbos here, which is I'm quite surprised that there hasn't been already initiatives towards this, because it's the most growing sector of the tourism industry, and now we have so much focus on Lesbos as a hub of voluntary engagement. Okay, that's all we have for now. Thank you.